Hey everyone, I'm Lauren Malhoit, and I'm here with Jeff McDaniel, who is actually going to be the one running this very demo-heavy webinar. He's just got one slide, I promise. But before we jump into that, just a quick minute on what this is about. So we all know that network changes can cause problems because some parts of the network are simply, a little bit fragile. A firewall rule goes in, the ticket gets closed, and sometimes nobody even knows that there's a problem or something's broken until an application is down or an auditor asks for proof. For the company, that's two real problems. That's unplanned outages that carry real revenue and reputation costs, and of course compliance gaps that only surface at the worst possible time. And then for the engineers doing the work, it's a different version of the same problem. Inventories drift, your ticketing system, your sources of truth, your automation tools, they don't share context the way you need them to. And then after the change, you're still stuck manually collecting screenshots or updating Visios to prove that everything worked. So IP Fabric actually sits across all of that, not just as another network tool, but as the verified ground truth, the actual glue that connects all of the platforms that you're already using, your ServiceNow and other ITSMs and CMDBs, your DSIMs and asset management, Ansible, Terraform, other automation tools, and of course now I would be remiss to not say any LLM of your choice, because IP Fabric's MCP server will even work with your in-house built LLMs. So in the next 30 minutes, we're going to show you how this could look in your environment. Again, please ask questions via the Q&A or look at the Docs tab. And again, you can zoom in on anything that Jeff is about to show. But with that, I'm going to pass to Jeff to get to the meat of the webinar here.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Lauren. So when we talk about change management and automation today, as Lauren mentioned, this is just one slide. I'm just going to talk to it for a few minutes, and then we'll get right into the UI and our AI ops and how this plays out in our environments. And so, the number one theme that it seems like that I speak to and IP Fabric speaks to in customer environments is with regard to what the infrastructure looks like. I mean, in our mind, we have what we would like the infrastructure to look like, but that's not a lot of times based in reality. And so IP Fabric, when we go to discover and observe the environment, we're actually showing you a completed picture of what your network actually looks like, how it's functioning. So we're not just talking interconnectability, we're talking VRFs in play, any other dynamic routes, interfaces. So you think about layer 1 through layer 4, and then we're grabbing that device configuration for routers and switches and load balancers and firewalls, even down to policies that block or allow traffic on the firewall. So we can map that end to end. So that's the nicety. That's the awesome thing to have. But the reality is, in an environment that is dynamic, right? In your environments that change, maybe not on a daily basis, but if you're using dynamic routes, dynamic routing protocols like OSPF and BGP, those do change sometimes minute by minute. And so 10 o'clock yesterday morning, something might look different than what it looks like today. So when we talk about change control and change management, that's the number one discussion point that customers will talk to us, and they say, well, we think we know what the network looks like, and we make changes, and sometimes the changes go well, and other times we don't find out until the next day that we missed something. And that's really the thought of IP Fabric, is being able to give you that visibility beforehand. And we do that via a snapshot method. And you don't have to snapshot the entire environment. In our scenario that we're going to run through, there's just a few devices you snapshot. We update that snapshot, and literally in a few seconds, we can actually see then, are we ready to go? The work that's being completed, was it completed properly? And so this can be done automated, and we'll actually kind of go through that automation process and verify via, again, snapshots. But then we can apply that against compliance checks. Maybe audit or your compliance department says, hey, before you do something, you need to prove something is in place. And IP Fabric is a great way to be able to prove and have that validation of asset control and you guys know what you're doing, right? And so really the outcome for a change control is being able to detect any unplanned or unauthorized changes, or maybe somebody doesn't do something that they should do in a change window. You can catch it before you close the change window out. And just talking about, the automation standpoint, we do talk a lot about AI ops today with our customers, and customers do want to use AI to be able to do very specific things in the network. And some are trying and some are successful, but a lot of them just don't know where to go. And with our MCP and you bring your LLM, we have tight integration with ServiceNow, NetBox, Ansible, Jira. We use a lot of this internally. So when I'm communicating with our engineering groups, a lot of times I can take what they tell me and disseminate that into our LLM. We use Claude and make it consumable for my customer. So it makes my job a lot easier. I don't have to spend 2 hours rewriting something very technical to be able to send to an executive. I use Claude to be able to do that. And really, what I'm doing too for customers is when we're using Claude, is I'm taking away that manual verification step. So when we put a script in, I actually have Claude tell me, hey, number one, is the script valid? And once the change goes in, did we meet that? And really, by having something, obviously AI makes mistakes. You have to validate what you're being told. But really, ultimately, what that does is that reduces risk in our environment. And anytime that you purchase or look at a product, if you can't reduce risk in your environment, then I would maybe say maybe you shouldn't look at that platform. If you're introducing risk to the business, then maybe that's not something you want to look at, right? And that's the whole thought of IP Fabric, is reducing risk in your environment. So when we talk about change management, first of all, we need to understand what we're looking at from a device perspective. So we're API first, and we've been so since the foundation of the company. And what APIs give IP Fabric is it makes us very extensible. So when you want to query or make changes in your infrastructure, IP Fabric is a great platform to be able to do that. So when we inventory a device, and we'll spare how we do that, but it's done very quickly through SSH, and I'll leave it at that. What we're doing is we're not just grabbing interfaces on a device. We're actually grabbing things like routes. If there's VRFs in play, right? If there are port channels, if you're doing line bonding like LACP, we're grabbing that entire configuration for that device, and we put it in a tabular format like you see here. And then you can click down on the device and look at all the the attributes in detail. But what that ultimately does is it builds out a network map. And this network map, by the way, is something that's typically very hard to do, right? When you think about technology, we're not just showing you interdependencies of this firewall is connected to this router. I'm showing you layer 1 and layer 2 information, and also layer 3 information. So it's not just that we have OSPF, that there's 4 sessions. I can actually open that up, and I can actually look at the OSPF sessions, and I can look at things like VRFs in play, or if there's IP addresses or cost pathing. We actually show you that information. So what that does then in a change window, let's kind of walk through this scenario, that we have this firewall that we want to pull off our BGP and OS. Basically, we only want it to be the enforcement for policies outside the network. We want to put a new firewall in, and this new firewall, we want to be able to attach and cross-connect these devices and have it be part of that OSPF neighborship. So in our change window, we're going to create a pre-change snapshot. We'll call it up here pre-change. And we go ahead and complete the work. And while I'm sitting at my conference room table or remote, whatever it is, the network engineer tells us, hey, we're actually done with the work, so we should be good to go, right? So I can actually create another snapshot in less than a minute. I see my updated map, and I can see that I have gigabit Ethernet 01 connected to Ethernet 2 on this router. And I've got an OSPF session configured, but on this, from this firewall to this router, I only have my interconnect or my crosslink, but I don't actually have OSPF configured on it. So the risk is if I'm not actively looking at these devices, myself, and I'm looking over somebody's shoulder, the risk is we close the change window out and I've got an incomplete configuration, right? So what we can do is I can communicate during the change window, say, hey, Mr. Network Engineer, Mrs. Network Engineer, we need to configure OSPF relationship, neighborship between these two guys. Once that's done, we go ahead and create one more snapshot, and then we see that OSPF is enabled, right? And so then I can actually close out the change window with a very, very high degree of confidence that we have everything configured, not just from the OSPF side, but now you can even see we've got our BGP session enabled and configured properly as well, right? So
Jeff,
go
something
ahead.
that is kind of sticking with me here, just in the first few minutes, right? We covered it's BYOLLM. It's an open strategy there. We can look at multiple how we can integrate with multiple other solutions through our extensibility. And then the fact that you have a multi-vendor network map here where you can see everything that you just showed, regardless of whether that's a Palo Alto firewall, a Cisco router, whatever the case may be. I think it's worth pointing out the open and multi-vendor nature of everything.
Yes, absolutely. And by the way, so you're absolutely correct. We are agnostic when it comes to our vendors, when it comes to the firewall vendors. Most vendors we support using SSH. There are some vendors like Meraki. We connect to those devices and grab configuration through an API. But we do support and can map out all the interdependencies like you see here. Again, and especially Cisco, whether you're talking Catalyst or you're talking ACI, those environments we show in a single pane of glass as well, and we can show you that path all the way through, right? So when we look at then AI ops, and we look at saying, well, what can I use an AI or an LLM, and how can I leverage that, right? So and by the way, I'm not really an Ansible guy. I'm more of a Terraform guy, but so Ansible is something I've been learning. But Claude has been a great help as far as just how you build that out. So one of the things that we could do is think about that work that we just talked about with the network map. Typically, you're going to have a network engineer go to the firewall. You're going to configure all your OSPF parameters. You're going to connect to the router. You're going to do the same thing, define the neighbors. And so there's a lot of work that's got to be done. You can copy and paste some of that, but it is open to human error. So one of the things we're able to do is I can actually ask, in this case, you'll see here, write an Ansible script to enable OSPF between these three devices in Paris, right? And so what it'll do is the LLM, your LLM of choice, contacts the MCP server. By the way, the MCP server, it ships as a integrated feature of the virtual appliance now. It is opt-in, right? So you have to opt in to it. It's just not running that anybody can connect to it. And it's all API driven and keys. And so it's very, very, very secure. But we can actually then take an LLM and get an LLM to do something for us very quickly. So when I just wrote this natural language query, it came up in 2 seconds, not 2 seconds, but probably 30 seconds, and said, well, let me go ahead and write an inventory, and let's go ahead and write the script. So when I look at the script, right, IP Fabric understands that this is a Cisco device and it's Cisco iOS. There was this firewall was actually a Juniper JunoOS firewall, and then this other gateway was an Arista EOS. So what it does is it'll go through and automatically configure the Ansible script. Now, of course, me as an engineer, an Ansible engineer, I'm going to go through and just validate this, maybe push it in a lab just to make sure that the script is valid. But literally in less than 30 seconds and 20 seconds, I have a functional script that I can actually use to be able to push this change through instead of having to rely on human eyes and human hands, on keyboard. So the other thing when we talk about validation and audit, so think of working through that change management process. Maybe part of the process is on a device, show me all device configuration changes. So maybe audit comes to you and says, "Hey, we want to make sure you're following best practices with regard to your change management. So we want you to show all device configuration changes on this firewall in Paris over the last 10 snapshots," right? And so IP Fabric, since we have that data in snapshots, the LLM very easily through the MCP server can look at that. It can gather all the snapshots and it can actually detail out what was changed. Now, I asked a basic question that said over the past 10 snapshots. So you do have to be specific. So what it's going to do is just show that there's IPsec VPN to AWS added, there's an access control list added, BGP redesigned, and OSPF added, which is what we'd expect. This was our change window. And so SNMP and some other things that were added. Now, I could have been more specific and said, show me changes over the last 10 snapshots, snapshot to snapshot with a date timestamp. And so that way I can get very granular on what's actually changed in my environment, right? So then we can also look at very specific things like an OSPF health report. And I spelled it wrong, right? Didn't actually do that on purpose, but it knew what I meant. So what it's going to do, it's going to look at all my sites. It's going to give me my state status. It's going to show me all my total neighborships, my OSPF interfaces, and the number of areas. So I've got 2 areas, obviously. And then it's going to show me my configuration. Now I'm just piping this out into Claude, but I could certainly pipe this out into a Word doc or a PowerPoint, and Claude can do that easily. So you could actually send this to somebody in audit or compliance. And so basically, I'm able to start with creating a script to do the work automatically, or at least semi-automatically. I can also validate changes using AI ops and just validate that, hey, do we have appropriate change control for each one of these changes? And then I can actually use AI or an LLM to just validate health of the network, or troubleshoot OSPF. If you know you're having an OSPF issue in London, let's say, you could just simply query and say, troubleshoot OSPF in London. And so it's going to go through and compare the snapshot and all the devices and say, here's what's going on. So what it'll first do is when you go to troubleshoot, it'll create a snapshot initially, and then it compares that working snapshot with the previous known good snapshot, and it'll start to be able to tell you that, hey, here's what's going on within the network. So when
What I
we
love,
look at, go ahead.
Jeff, just some, we always think about AI and hallucinating, and the fact that IP Fabric provides the ground truth, and you can even ask it for, a link back to the GUI to prove, like cite your sources, Claude kind of thing,
Yes.
or even an API endpoint to, programmatically get that information.
Yeah, and so that's actually a phenomenal point right there. Is IP Fabric deals with what your network actually looks like at that point in time. So we talk about LLM hallucinations, right? And so when you start talking about modeling, or maybe I want to do this, sometimes an LLM will just go off into the ether. And it does. It actually starts to hallucinate and think that things are there or not there that maybe are or aren't. We're grounded in, when I say reality, it's not a slant on anybody else. It's just we're dealing with, here are how the devices are configured. So it's an actual enumerated data set. And so it's very easy for the LLM to look at that and say, well, here's what it is. And here's 3 configuration details, and one of them's wrong. And so it's, again, when you look at false positives, I don't want to say there's 0 false positives on anything, whether you're security or network, but I'm going to have a way higher degree of confidence in what the LLM's telling me about IP Fabric maybe than other platforms. That's a great point. So when we look at then, okay, I can script this, I can validate changes, I can just look at the health, but I also want to have something kind of watching the back door. And we call that intent check. So when we look at our dashboard, an intent check for us we have about 160 out of the box intent checks. So by the way, an intent check for us is more than just is something up or down, right? Maybe I have first, we'll call it first hop redundancy protocol. And so maybe you've got a core switch, and so you're using a high availability and you're using HSRP for IP management, right? So there's things that IP Fabric knows, since we're gathering the configuration of the devices, not just how they're configured, but line by line configuration on Cisco and Juniper and Arista and everything else, is that we know if a configuration changes or there's something wrong with the IP management, we're going to actually kick up saying, hey, there's something inconsistent. So anything green is awesome, good. Anything 10 means that, or anything blue says, hey, there's devices that maybe aren't redundant, that are maybe core, but maybe these are smaller sites. But anything that's red, that means you have something that's not built for best practice. So that would mean there's a high degree of certainty that if you do a failover to that secondary switch, you'll actually have an outage. So this is more of a predictive analysis to say, if the configs don't match, if something is off within the config that's going to impede IP or routing, then we're going to kick off that alert and notification, right? So so when we talk about intent checks, I can go into the UI and create an intent check, and it's somewhere between 5 and 10 clicks, but I have to be very specific on what the parameters need to be. And so then I do, as an engineer, I have to give some forethought on what do I want the intent check to look like, and how do I want it to be configured. So when I'm working with customers, I might have a session where they want to create 10 intent checks. So I'm going to spend 2 to 3 hours, maybe 4 hours, writing them with them. We're going to test them out and then put them in production. But we found out that AI ops is very specific. So if I say something like, write an intent check for this device, if any OSPF sessions drop, write an intent check for me on this. And so I can go into the UI and create this, and it takes me 10 minutes to do it, or I can just have the LLM tell me what to do. So go to intent verifications, click add rule, blah, blah, blah. So it'll tell me what to do. It can also create the JSON file, so it automatically creates it. So the only thing I do is create the intent check. I just import the JSON file, and literally in less than a minute, I have my intent check created. So it's a great way to validate that we just maintain a working set for the infrastructure that we have.
I
So with
love
the
that
go ahead.
example. I love that example, Jeff, because first of all, you're definitely getting deterministic outcomes from the IP Fabric intent check, but also these repetitive tasks that you want to just check every morning or after every change window. Now I can just go to the dashboard and look at it, and I've used Claude or whatever LLM to do it just one time. So I'm saving tokens if I am using a public LLM. But
Yes.
I'm still getting the information that I need every single day.
Yep, that's absolutely it. Very accurate. So the last minute, let me just do this. Let's talk about what this could look like, right? So we've talked about semi-automation with an Ansible script, but we do have some customers doing this, and some of it's created on their own. Some of it they work with partners, but IP Fabric is always an integral part of this automation process. So let's talk about, and this is something I talk to customers a lot about, firewall rule change, right? And so think about your process when a user or a server administrator requests a rule change. So in this case, require RDP access to my SQL servers, right? And so I'm Jeff. So what we're going to do is say, analyze with IP Fabric. So the first thing we do on this portal is take a snapshot. We're going to look at the source subnet, the destination subnet, and I can see that based on my path, this is the end-to-end path, I have 2 firewalls in here that restrict this policy. Now, whether RDP is secure, insecure, that's not the point. We just have to use it. So we have 2 firewalls that we know we need to implement this change. So we can click continue to review it. I'm the user and I say, yep, this looks good. Even though there's a PCI risk on this, I'm going to go ahead and submit the change. When we look at ServiceNow, right, we can integrate this in with ServiceNow. We have deep integration with ServiceNow. So you can actually put this in a ticket format into ServiceNow. And thought I had logged in beforehand. My apologies. So we look at the ticket information into ServiceNow, and we can automatically build in things like informational. I've already got one here shown, brought up. So I've got RDP access required by Jeff. So I can see my business justification, what the implementation plan looks like. Again, going back to the AI ops, since we know exactly what needs to be done as far as the Ansible, firewall rule YAML, the risk and impact analysis, and the backout plan, right? And here's my test plan. So once a senior manager approves this, right, we're able to go through and say, let's simulate. In this case, it's going to be a simulated change, but this is a valid change. So what's going to happen is we show you the path beforehand, and we show you the path after this change has been made. So again, this is completely possible. This is in the world of reality today, using automation tools like Ansible, NetBox, and ServiceNow for the change management control. So I'll stop there. Lauren, let's go to Q&A.
Yeah, so thanks, Jeff. That was awesome. And I do want to make sure that folks realize everything Jeff just showed is actually, or in that last section is, that's all automation. Like that was not AI filling out that ServiceNow change request. It was actually, a backend template on the self-service portal. So even if you're not in, far enough along on your AI journey yet, all of this is still possible. But then, of course, you can use AI to just populate that change request as well. So I'm just looking through the Q&A quickly. Jeff, what is the most common change management question that you get when you're talking to customers?
So probably the most common one is, well, how do you validate? So when we make a change during the window, and that's kind of why I gave the example, how do you actually validate, and what information can you show during that window? And so we do that based on a snapshot. So if I'm the engineer looking at this change, I'm going to do two things. The map is nice, right, in that I can see visually what's actually going on, but I can go to my device, whatever device that there is, and I can go through, whatever I need to look at to make sure that what was needed to be configured is configured.
Yeah, no, I think that says it all right there. Before you make the change, like we talk a lot about validation, but before you make the change, people talk about blast radius, whether we call it blast radius or a dependency map or whatever. How do I understand the impact? I saw that was in the service request. How do we get that information about the impact analysis?
So a lot of times that impact analysis, we need to understand what is affected. And so that's a great part when IP Fabric builds that snapshot. We can very quickly say, okay, what are the interdependencies when we talk about end-to-end map, right? We know the blast radius is not just the source and destination, but what is that entire path through the process of the traversal of the packet? And so that's how we build that out, is we do that through this end-to-end map. Just get here really quick. So if I, again, in this scenario, source and destination, I can submit this out, and I can actually build what this map looks like, right? This is the blast radius. This is the path of whatever change is going to be impacted.
Yeah, that is the point right there, right? Just how easy it is to get that information, especially without having to log into every device. But even if that firewall were blocked, I could see the rest of that path.
Yes,
Speaking of
and
firewalls, oh, go ahead.
yep, and even down to details, right? So I can actually see if I make this change or this change was made, is the firewall allowing this traffic? And so we even gather that detail down to the firewall policy, that if the firewall was blocking it, it'd be red, and then I could go to the policy to see which policy was actually blocking the traversal of the packet.
So I know we're over time here, Jeff, but just one more thing that I think would be great to show folks. Like you've shown them part of the like the information that we get about firewalls. Where are some other things, both for prepping for, let's say, a firewall rule change, but then validating? Where are you going to go to make sure, besides the end-to-end path analysis, to make sure that things look right?
Yeah, so great point. When we talk about configuration, so maybe I have a router, and let's just pick this. I'm going to pick this as an example. I'm assuming there's a change on this guy, and there is. So I can actually take a look at pre and post configuration change of a device. So this is the snapshot before the change, right? So maybe I'm a CCSE or CCSE. Wow. Sorry, it's been a long day so far. Maybe I'm a Cisco expert, and I want to actually just validate this with my own eyes. So we can show you the config side by side or an inline diff. So I can actually look at what was actually changed and what was added to the router during that change window. So I can actually validate it based on the configuration of the device.
Yeah, I think that's just really key to be able to compare those things right there, and for any device. Jeff, thank you so much. This was really helpful. I know for everyone, it was probably a lot of information to take in. Of course, the recording will be available. And of course, we're always available to meet with you live and take questions. Any final words, Jeff, from you?
I would say, IP Fabric is a great asset and a great tool to be able to not only understand infrastructure, but moving forward and pathing out change inside of businesses. It's a great way to go. It's a great platform.
Awesome. Okay. Thanks, Jeff. And thanks everyone for watching. And like I said, reach out and we'll chat with you soon. Thanks.